mic check, please.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Ducks Unlimited podcast. I'm your host, Chris Jennings.
I'm your host, Dr. Mike Brazier.
My name is John Gordon. I'll be your host.
And I'm your host, Katie Burke.
Welcome to the Ducks Unlimited podcast, the only podcast about all things waterfowl. From hunting insights to science-based discussions about ducks, geese, and issues affecting waterfowl and wetlands conservation in North America. We bring the resource to you, the DU Podcast.
Well, hi, everybody. Welcome back to the show. Today on the show, we have two special guests. One returning. We have Ryan Graves, call collector. Hi, Ryan. Welcome to the show.
Hey, glad to be here.
All right, we also have a new guest, which a lot of you probably know of him. This is John Stevens of RNT Calls and Jay Stevens Calls. Welcome to the show, John.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Also, John is a call collector. Do you collect decoys or just calls? Or
it's probably easier to eliminate what I don't collect.
Yeah. Okay.
I've been a collector I've been a collector since a kid. I've collected everything from dust to stamps to, I don't know what it is. I think it's just a genetic thing, but I'm mainly a duck calls, but I do have an interest in decoys and I do own a few.
Yeah.
I'm still trying to learn a little bit about them. So it's interesting just because how much it is a part of waterfowl,
right,
and the tradition and the craftsmanship. So I enjoy that aspect of it.
Do you find it hard? Because I find this hard. We don't really have a decoy maker in our area for Arkansas, Mississippi, Tennessee, this like Mississippi Delta area. Do you find it hard picking what to collect because you don't have that history connection to kind of jump off of?
Well, it's kind of like duck calls. When I started duck calls, I was going to just try to focus on one thing, and then I figured out real fast that since I like to collect, that wasn't going to work for me. So, I try to, at first with decoys, I was going to collect decoys that were actually duck call makers that did both, just because I thought that had a connection, and then that just opened the door to seeing other decoys. And so now I kind of do it based on what I like and what I can afford. You know? So
that makes sense. Yeah, I always find that interesting, and because we're kind of in a desert of decoys down here, where they're all over the country, but not in this very ducky area of the country. That's
always fascinated me too, why we don't. We have a bunch of different reasons. I think it's because there was such a focus on calls and and flooded timber, but whatever the reason is,
they just didn't need them. I guess that's the only thing I can come up with is they just didn't need them as much.
Yeah, and I guess really Ryan isn't the only ones really actually moved here. Decoy makers.
Yeah, exactly. Early on, Mississippi did have like a strong decoy.
But that's South Mississippi, right?
Yeah. It would have been Pascagoula, or I'm sure I butchered that.
Yeah, Pascagoula. You're right.
Pascagoula, but there were so many decoy factories there back in the day.
Yeah,
and like I say, and that's where that's where Charles Grubbs, when he left the Illinois River, he moved down to that area, got into the decoy business and all that. But yeah, as far as when you get down here to the the Mid South and the South, like I say, Louisiana's got a culture of decoys.
Yep.
But like I say, Arkansas and Tennessee, like I say, Missouri's got some, but mainly like I say, Arkansas, there's none.
There's nothing. Yeah, it's interesting. So I wonder, like, when did we start bringing in decoys, and what were they? Were they herders, or like we go back earlier than that?
That's an interesting question. I've never really thought about it in Arkansas, but you do hear stories of people from here that actually bought calls by. Decoys that were from Illinois decoy makers. So I know there's a guy here that owned some Graves decoys back in the day, and there's a few Purdue, so I don't really know what the time frame is on that. But, the biggest thing here, like I said, was flooded timber, and people called, kicked water, and had painted Coke bottles, stuff like that.
I always heard like milk jugs painted black. Yeah. Interesting. Well, anyway, so let's go back. For those of the listeners that don't know who you are, let's kind of go back. Always ask new guests to tell us like your intro into duck hunting, and then let's go into call making and like collecting. So let's kind of give your little history.
Okay, well, I was born in Stuttgart here, which duck hunting and duck calling is big deal.
Big deal.
It's always fascinating to people that we actually have duck call clinics and classes, as you're a kid to learn to blow duck calls. So obviously with the World Championship Duck Calling Contest, it's just in our culture here. And growing up on the Grand Prairie, my dad is actually from Mississippi.
Okay.
He's from around Meridian, Mississippi.
Okay.
He met my mom he was at Mississippi State. She was at MSCW back in the day in
So
Columbus.
that's how you got to Mississippi State.
Yeah.
Right.
So
I'm an Ole Miss fan.
Oh, okay. Well, so was my wife. So,
Oh, good.
Yeah, she attended the University of Mississippi. So it was, he moved here to farm rice and helped my granddad who had cancer at the time. He actually graduated and worked in Huntsville, Alabama at Redstone Arsenal for NASA. And he decided he didn't want to work in an office, so he moved here. Yeah. And so just from that rice farm, that's just kind of growing up hunting with him and doing stuff, that's kind of how I got into duck hunting. And it's not a glamorous story or anything normal, when you're from Stuttgart, that's just kind of what you do. But probably when I was 5 or 6, I was actually in a blind with he and another guy, and there wasn't many ducks flying. And so they gave me a duck call. I made a lot of racket. A duck came in that they shot. It was not coming in because of my calling, I promise you. But
you could at least lie and say it to yourself and say it was.
Yeah, well, I took a picture holding the duck and the duck call. From my memory, that was really what got me into it. Yeah. I don't know. I guess I felt like I participated in the hunt besides just going along. And I went on some hunts with him. He was real good about taking me and not making you sit too long or do whatever, taking snacks, just making it fun. And then about the time I got old enough to, we talked about the youth clinics here. Chick Majors, who made duck calls in the 40s and 50s, 60s, and on to the 70s, passed on. He started the children's clinic here in Stuttgart then, and then he kind of passed that on to Butch Richenbach, which I kind of took over from Butch after he had passed away or got done doing them. And we start in first grade. We have a beginners, then a semi-advanced, and an advanced. So we do it. We start in October. It runs through Thanksgiving. I want to say it's like 6 to 8 weeks long. We do it 2 times a week. Okay. And that's kind of
how long are they each one? Like an hour? Or?
Oh, Lord, no.
Yeah, I was going to say, they can't be long.
They're
little.
20 minutes. And I tell people, I said, that doesn't seem like long, but I promise you that's a long time because their attention span's not a whole lot at that age.
I got a 6, a 3, and a 5-month-old. Yeah, that's perfect.
Yeah, and you get 20 of them in a room blowing duck calls. That's 20 minutes is
it's all you need.
Yeah. So just going through that clinic, that's how I got interested in the calling. And like when I was in the second year of the semi-advanced, we'd have a little competition after at the end of the year of each clinic. And so and they kind of do it kind of like the Worlds where you blow 3 rounds and doing all this. So one of the judges was Johnny Monfus, who was the world champion caller here at the time. Okay. And I would have had to been 9. And he had told my parents that, man, he's pretty good at calling. He should go take private lessons from Butch Richenbach. And I didn't know anything about it. I've gone down to the contest and seen, the world. But at that point, I really didn't have that much interest because if you've been to a duck calling contest, it's not the biggest spectator sport in the world.
No, it's not. It's pretty.
So
it's
at that age, I didn't really watch a lot of it until after I got involved in it. So that's kind of how I started. Once I got into doing the private lessons and competing in some of the contests in the junior world, I had family members that would like give me their old calls because I was competing in contests, and stuff. And so, and plus going over to Butch's, sitting there watching him turn calls, even at that young age, it was just really fascinating to me. Mm-hmm. And I knew when I saw him turning calls that that's what I wanted to do. I didn't really know if it was a real job or anything. You don't really think about jobs at that age, but I knew it was something I wanted to learn to do. Right. And I started making little hat pins over the shop and doing these different things. And so through that and through Butch's clinic and through working at his shop, that's where, like I said, people started giving me old calls. And I'm a natural collector, so I was just, I was collecting, didn't really know what I was doing. Yeah. And by the time I got, I'm trying to think when it would have been 1986. Is that when the call collectors thing was founded, Ryan? Or was it 85 or 86?
I think it was 88 or 89.
Okay. So somewhere around.
Well, say what that is real quick, Ryan.
Oh, it's the Call Collectors Association of America. Actually, at one point there was like 25 collectors got together to, just to form a group of people to promote, call collecting and call making. So
during the festival, they would have like different tents set up with crafts and things. And actually, one year they had a call collectors event or tent, and so I had joined the Call Collectors Association at that time. I would have been 15 if that was in 88. And so
Definitely
I
the
missed
youngest member of the Call Collectors.
What's cool is I missed it
Association.
by 1 year. If I'd have known about year 4, I could have been with the founding members, which would have kind of been cool. So, and I still got my certificate over there on the wall. So,
Oh, I didn't even notice it.
Yeah.
Oh, I'll have to take a picture of it.
so that's when I went to that. I got to meet other call makers, and they were like, "Bring your calls up here." So I went home, and I remember getting all my calls, and they gave me a table, and I had like bath towels. My mom would have been so embarrassed. I had all my calls like, just laid on bath towels from the house because I couldn't find anything else. And they really got a kick out of it. And I met like Howard Harlan, some of these guys. And Mr. Howard was just coming out with his book around that time, the first book. It may actually been around then. There's Brian McGrath. I think I'm saying that
that's
right.
about
McGrath
right
had
because
one.
we were still publishing books because we published that.
So that was really the first time that I'd had even learned much about any other calls from outside. You know, when you're from Stuttgart, you think it all revolves around Stuttgart when you're that young, you know, and or Arkansas. And so starting to learn about, man, they made calls in Illinois and, all these other places, Tennessee. And it was fascinating to me to know that there was other calls out there and call makers. So that's really kind of how I got started in the collecting, and that it just steamrolled from there or snowballed from there. And I was able to meet Biff Morgan, who's from Little Rock, and he really was probably my mentor at a young age at collecting.
For collecting.
Yeah, he was big Arkansas call collector and promoter of Arkansas calls. He had a little section in the Arkansas Sportsman's Almanac that was put out, I would say, in the 90s. It was about different areas in Arkansas, hunting, duck hunting, but in the back they had a little section on calls. Okay. And I can remember when I looked through those pages, I had no idea of all the different call makers from Arkansas.
There's so many.
Yeah, I knew a lot of them, but there was so many, like Northeast Arkansas. I've heard of Beckhart, but at that time, wasn't the internet. There wasn't all that, so you didn't have access to a lot of these things.
Right.
And so these first books were huge.
Yeah, and Mike Lewis just put out the first strictly Arkansas one a few years ago. That wasn't even that long ago.
Yeah, and that's a nice book. There's all these books just having the images, and the pictures of seeing the calls. I mean, you hear people talk about them. Like I said, now you can Google it and find a picture of one. But back then you didn't. So those books, all my books were just worn completely out, within a year just through looking at them.
So when did you start traveling around to see some more calls? You hear about collectors going to their other collectors' houses, or for calls you can go to the collector at certain places. Did you do that at all at a young age?
There just wasn't still. I guess I didn't know. I was young. So, my parents, they were really good about taking me to compete in duck calling contests, but, probably pushing the envelope to take me to an old man that collected duck calls house and leave me at that young age to look at calls. Yeah. But, there was, like I said, I met Biff Morgan, met Howard Harlan. And at that time, the duck calling contest here, that was probably the biggest show I went to that actually had older calls.
Right.
But there was a lot of people, the Beret brothers from Arkansas bought and sold calls, and they used to put out a little mailing list or newsletter that when they would have calls for sale, and you could mail in your money and get. It's just crazy how that worked back then. A list of calls, and if you go look at those lists now and see what they were selling
That's actually pretty advanced for them to have mail-in call lists.
And the prices were crazy. Like if you knew that then, you would have bought everything they had.
But they were expensive then.
But that's really, that and the newsletter at the time, that was just how the newsletter, the Call Makers and Collectors Association newsletter, had a lot of stuff in it. But there was a few guys that I could go see, but it was mostly probably at duck calling contests, actually, if anything at that young age, and talking to them. But there wasn't as much that I had access to at a younger age. The older I got, through college, and then I kind of took a little break from collecting. I never really just quit, but once I purchased Rich-N-Tone, it just a lot of things changed for me. We were working calls, doing stuff, and trying to figure out how to run a business and doing different things. And I never lost the interest in it. I don't know.
You were a young dad at that point too, right? As someone who has kids, that takes a lot out of you. Yeah.
I still enjoyed it. Talking about calls, but there was just a time where I don't want to say I got burned out because that's what I did the whole time, but it was a different pressure level. Like you're saying, we're trying to figure out, I guess, your job and how to run it and do all this. Because, I was still pretty young when we bought Rich-N-Tone, so we had to figure out, Angie and I, how we were going to, make a living.
Yeah.
It sounds good that we're going to make duck calls and make a living, but until you have to really do it, there's a lot of things that change. Yeah. And at that time, a call company would have been like Haydale, our bigger
right
production call company. There wasn't many like custom call
So
manufacturers.
when did you get when did you buy Rich and Tone?
In 1999.
Yeah, I was gonna say, it was like Primos then.
Yeah,
was a
there
big
was
one, and
there was just a few that were starting to try to make the step to a bigger scale of sales, and that would have been like Mike Keller, some of these other guys that really did it and got out and sold to other
Right.
stores, and they started using CNC equipment and stuff, and that's kind of how it got started. Well, actually, Ryan is about the time I started. My interest started getting back into it, and my head getting back into it and starting to enjoy it is when Ron and I's paths have crossed. We knew each other, but we really didn't know each other like we do now and talk about collecting. So that was really about the time that I started back into it heavier.
Yeah.
Was that 2000? And it would have had to be
like 2015 because it was not too long after Butch had passed away.
Yeah.
yeah. So what was your collection at that point, Ryan?
I mean, all over the place.
Yeah.
You know,
were you focused on Illinois, or are you still kind of?
Yeah, I mean, Illinois was always my direct focus. Like John said, like he was only going to collect Arkansas. Well, being that I was from Illinois, I was only going to collect Illinois.
Right.
Then it got into I'm only going to collect stuff from areas that I've hunted. That didn't leave me any room. So at that point, I was. I had really gotten close with him. I fell up in Chicago, Bob Christensen, that wrote the Duck Call of Illinois book, which would have probably been probably 6, 7, 8 years, prior to that. And, I had been getting calls from him for years, and like I said, most of those were Illinois calls. But like I said, Illinois was always my focus. But a good collector, no matter where it came from, something come up, I had to find a way to buy it.
Right. So when you go back into collecting, so you're collecting and then you kind of take your break. And then when you start to go back in, how has your focus changed from that beginning of a collector and then now you're back into it again? Have you what was your motivation at that point and what were you thinking about?
I just think a lot of it, like I said, just from work standpoint, I just kind of took my calls, put them in my safe, never got them out, and just nose to the grindstone work,
Yeah.
And when we got to the point to where it started to being a little more comfortable, and Angie always say it's never comfortable, but where our business was more comfortable. I guess just from like different call forums and seeing people talking about calls, I got my calls out one day and started going through them, and I started just realizing how cool the calls were and how much I kind of missed it, and enjoyed it. So I don't want to say slowly because I don't hardly ever slowly do anything, but I got back into it and it ramped up, and I didn't really have as much of a focus as I was just excited to be back. Like when you collect stuff and that, and just when I was getting them out, it's just like I just was backfilled with that passion that got me started.
Yeah.
So it was just exciting to get them out, and then like I said, talking to Ryan with them, and he came down and saw some of my calls.
He gets excited too.
Yeah, I know. And then we just geeked out, on each other's calls, and that was really what got me back to doing things.
Yeah.
So then I started trying to make a list, like you're saying, a focus of what I didn't have. Like if it was Arkansas or different areas, and I was going to try to get those. And then I thought, well, I really just talking to different collectors and decoy collectors. My focus just kind of changed to, there are some important calls that I probably need from other areas, but I want to buy stuff that I like. Don't worry about so much about the other stuff. Just buy what you like. And if it's, I used to try to think if I had one Beckhardt and one of these, that's all I needed. If there's like 2 or 3 of one call makers that I like, why not try to purchase them? Because you want stuff that you like and you enjoy looking at.
No, I agree with that. I do. I agree with that too. Because when I look at decoys and stuff, like there's certain decoys I love, but I love like the really folksy ones that don't really even look like ducks. But those are the ones that I kind of lean towards, like the Louisiana style ones that just kind of have that funky look to them. But I think you should just go with what you like. So I do have a question as someone who like carves and like creates calls and turns calls. How has the old collectors influenced, or actually first, how has being a call maker influenced your collecting?
So how is being a call maker influenced my collecting?
You know what you're doing, because you're turning calls and you see how they're made, and you know that like part of it. So how has that made you appreciate certain collectors over others?
I think a lot of it is like how I would grade some of the older call makers to what I like is a lot of it is really about overall design, kind of almost like overall sculptural appeal of the calls. That's probably my number one thing is looking. My God, I have some in here. John Morrow is one of my favorite call makers just because his calls are so sculpturesque kind of to me, and it's not like they're fancy, intricate. They're just his balance and design was so good. It has a
really interesting form to it. Yeah, it's a really pretty form.
So to me, that would be my first draw, and then just the craftsmanship, side. When you look at like Beckhart's and Ferguson's and the way they did stuff, I mean, it's really amazing that how they made stuff with the tools that they had at that time. Yeah. So that would be one, and then when you talk about the folk art side. Obviously, decoys and duck calls are all a form of folk art, but the ones that are really folky are really good. And I always say Charles Purdue is not necessarily my favorite call maker or favorite decoy maker, but he's probably my favorite waterfowl folk artist because he made all kind of things, and that was
his owls. Like, the one thing he talks about is owls, but his owls are really cool too.
Yeah, he made a lot of unique stuff, and so I think that I have that approach as far as collecting, and I think it works vice versa. Making calls, also being a collector, definitely influences the way I make calls or the style that I make calls. And I'm a firm believer that there's probably not 100. There's not 100. There's not many original ideas anymore on things, but it's your influences, how you interpret the influences that you've had, and how you can use that and develop something that's maybe a little different, but. It kind of has your own flair to it, but also has the influences that you've had through there. And that's kind of how I look at call making, that it has just broadened my palette, I guess, of the ideas I can have if I didn't have the experience or the background of studying old calls, I think my call making style would be totally different.
Right. Yeah, that's almost an interesting thought experiment to think of like where you'd be if you didn't collect too. But we will never know. We'll never know. But it would be really interesting.
I always tell people if my mom and dad would have stayed in Birmingham, Alabama, or Huntsville, Alabama, if I would be a duck call maker, I'd probably be like a skateboarder and probably never shot a shotgun. I don't know.
Yeah, I feel you.
But it also, there's something about when something's in you, it's going to come out eventually.
I feel
so
you. Like, I don't know if I'd be here if I didn't grow up in Tallahatchie County. So,
right.
Yeah, I'm sure Ron has the same thing. It's interesting you talk about like the way, I mean, I think that in art in general, like as an art history person, like I don't ever think there ever was originally an original idea. I think we've always just taken what we've seen and then combined it in our own interpretation. And I think there'll always be new things, like in air quotes, but they'll still be like, eventually somebody will be taking your stuff and some like the older calls will be putting it together and coming up with new stuff.
You guys already have.
Yeah, exactly. I want to talk about the Jay Stevens calls because we've been talking about this a lot on the podcast with decoy makers. Like, you kind of have two camps of contemporary decoy makers. You have the guys like Cameron McIntyre and Marty Hansen and George Strunk and all these guys like that, and McNair, that are doing it strictly to the old way, and that's kind of like. And then there's these guys that are kind of like they're doing a little bit different, more like factory wise, and they kind of have very different beliefs on the quality. There's such a big camp on each side of what people think is good and whatever. But call making, there's lots of incredibly talented call makers out there still calling, but you're one of the only ones doing it the old way. And why did you decide to start? When did you start Jay Stevens, and when did you start to go that?
I don't know. I'm not going to say I'm the only person doing it the old way. There's still lots of people that make them by hand. There's still a lot of people that do that on the lathes and stuff. I think my style maybe be more leaning to the older looks of calls, and feels. And I think, again, that falls back to the collecting side and the history side. And one of the things I tried to do in everything from our tap room here to some of our calls we do on RNT is try to promote the history of calls or call making through different things. So that was one of the things with Jay Stevens too, just because I liked the looks of older calls.
Right.
That I wanted to try to do that, but also include some history so people could get familiar with the Batley I make. Is it doesn't really look like a call made by Batley, but he was the first guy to really wrap a call that we know of. So that somebody will see that and then be like, oh yeah, get interested in that and learn a little bit more about that. But so I kind of didn't really answer your question and almost kind of forgot what it was.
I kind of went a roundabout way of asking. But yeah, like I do like that you do that. Like kind of you're almost like force people to learn about the older stuff, which is really cool because I don't think people think about, there are people like us who collect and are into history. Like we think about that stuff all the time. Like it's just in us to think. Ryan's definitely one of them to like think about where things came from and what was before that. But it's nice to have a way to get other people involved that necessarily don't have that that history love in them to like just naturally go there. Because I'm going to go there every time. Like I want to ask that question. But anyway, yeah, I want to know like how with Jay Stevens. When did you start Jay Stevens first?
Oh, I should know that. I want to say it was 2015 too. That's kind of when a lot of that started, or 2016. I'm sorry. I won a Champions in 2015, and that was the same year that Butch had passed away. He passed away earlier that year, like in June or July, the summer of that. And so, kind of the same thing with him. I'd always made calls by hand, toyed around with it in my shop or garage, and not so much at RNT, but did that actually before I had purchased RNT. I've got some calls that I made when I was probably 10 or 11 years old and carved acorns on them and did little things like that, but not a lot. And so I started Jay Stevens in 2016, and it was kind of the same way Butch did. He'd learned from Chick Majors, but he did not want to start making his own calls until Chick was done, Chick had passed away about the time Butch was starting to make his calls, and so Butch had passed away that summer, and then not long after that, we had a fire and our building burned down. So, you say start from scratch. That was the best time to start it, I guess. And so, that's kind of how I did it. And it's funny because it kind of went in reverse order. Like when we purchased RNT, we had to figure out how to run a business on a larger scale. And the whole reason that I got into call making was because I actually like making calls. I like doing it by hand. And so we got to the point to where our business at that point was more of a well-oiled machine kind of thing. I could take time to do it. So as we were building this new shop, I just thought that would be the ideal time to do it. And that way when people come in here too, they could see how RNT is built, like today's type of calls, and then how they were made by hand through Jay Stevens. So you kind of got the best of both worlds. And it works great for me because that's why I got into doing this, because I wanted to make calls. So I get to do that and then still, making the living with RNT. So it's been fun. And, the thing when I started doing the Jay Stevens calls is I didn't want to take orders, and I just wanted to make what I wanted to make and don't worry about if anybody likes it. And I take them to the show and sell it. And, I didn't want, because I had a job that we take orders for calls. Right. So I didn't want it to ever impede on creativity or, be where you were so rushed. And I made the mistake of started taking orders. And, which I just do it at our Callapalooza VIP events. But we would have 30 people a night for 2 nights, and we would allow them to come in here and place an order. And that's what's sitting in front of y'all, about 2 years worth of orders. That's
probably closer to 3.
Yeah. Well, I've gotten caught up a little bit, but
that's a lot.
And it's not that it's a lot of calls. I'm just not very productive. And I don't mean that in a bad way, but people don't understand if all I did was sit in here, then I could knock them out. But I might could start on something, then I have to start and do something somewhere else with, RNT, because that's what pays the bill. So, and I also don't want it to get to where this is a burden. You got a duck hunt too. Yeah. That's priority. But I don't want it to get to where this is a burden at all. Not that my other job is, but I just want to be able to do this when I can and still enjoy it. So
no, I totally feel that. I was an art major for all of 1 year, and I hated it because I didn't like being told what to do. Yeah. So I get it. So you want to be able to keep that creativity, there's no pressure on it. Yeah.
So this is probably this will probably be the last ones that I actually take orders on. I don't think we're going to do that at the VIP events anymore. So
speaking of Callapalooza, can you tell us what that is and how many years it's been?
We started that on our grand opening, so that would have been 2019 when we opened the new shop. We just wanted to try to have an unveiling of the new shop And we were just spitballing ideas of what could we do else besides just say, hey, we're open for business. And so we thought, man, let's invite as many call makers to come and set up here, sell their calls, do whatever. And that just kind of evolved until saying, hey, let's make it like a celebration of the art of call making and like have seminars, have classes, have collectors come and trade and swap calls. And so basically it's a week-long celebration of call making, from different things. So it's really grown. The first year we came out of the chute was pretty good, and then COVID hit. So, like everything else, it kind of slowed for a year or two, but last year was our best year ever. And we've got a lot of things cool planned for this year. So that's been a exciting event and something that we're proud of, because we, that's what we try to do is promote not just collecting, but call making. And some people say, why do you want to promote call making when you're a call maker? And I don't view it as competition.
Right,
I'm a competitive person.
Right.
I like to win, but this is not about that. This is about kind of supporting art or craft that's, giving me a lot, and so, and it's a very big part of the Grand Prairie. So, and Arkansas, call making, and in other parts of the country too, as we talk. But so we want to get as many people as we can involved and show them how to do it. And, that's one of the things with the Call Makers and Collectors Association, they're really involved in that.
Okay.
And we have a Call Makers build-off contest through the week that we have here, where call makers go against each other and building calls. And it's a fun time.
Calls and stuff.
Yeah.
That's fun.
So it's a fun event.
Yeah. So let's go back to like contemporary call makers. So I feel like it's like increased, but has it increased or has it stayed steady?
I think it's definitely increased just because of technology and information.
Okay.
It's so much more accessible now than it used to be, just because of the internet. You can, I'm the world's worst nut about calling. Anything I don't know, that's the first thing I do is type it in my phone. How do I do this? How do I,
Well, there's the Facebook group. What's that Facebook group that they're always on there?
There's Call Nuts.
That's
there's a lot of them.
Yeah.
So I think there is, and you brought up a interesting question earlier, talking about the way or my style of making calls compared to other calls.
Yeah.
I think, and I keep bringing this up, but I think it has to do with your influences and your background a lot. A lot of the guys, there's some very, very, very talented guys that make calls that, carve stuff that just blow my mind when you look at them. And it's really cool to see how they do these intricate carvings. Then you got guys that make calls that look more like today's calls. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, contemporary acrylic.
And I think it's because I bet when you go back and look, these guys that carve, they have some kind of influence or history from carving at some point, or some kind of artistic, draw or background from that.
Yeah.
The guys that make calls that, when they say all today's kind of calls, which would be RNT included, kind of look similar. Probably because most of those guys, that's all they really known or have been around.
Right.
So like with me, I've been around the older ones, a lot too. And so that's kind of what influences those. And to me, it separates. I want to make what I like, but it also separates the look compared to newer stuff.
So that brings up a question in my mind. Like, and Ryan, you might have a thought about this too, but like access to the older calls. Like, if you're a collector and you work with other collectors, you get to see more calls, because especially if you're like going to things like Callapalooza or the Decoy Show in Chicago, you get to see and handle older calls. But besides here and at the Pyramid, there's not many places the general public can go and look at old calls. It's just
there's really not. And we always try to get more and more people into the vintage side of the hobby, but as collectors, I'm guilty of it myself. It becomes like an addiction, and you need a fix. And with old calls, you just can't go get a fix anytime you want to. But with a contemporary call or a custom made call, you can get them just about any time you want to, from somebody.
Right.
So it's like the vintage calls just aren't as readily available. And like I say, it's just you just kind of, as a collector, you just always got to be, I don't really collect contemporary stuff, but, as far as, vintage calls goes, I've got most of the cards that I want, but I still have I've still got that urge. So, I've been collecting baseball cards, that's just basically just to fill that void of, there hasn't been any old calls to come to market that I have to have, so it's like, you just have to have and that's what, keeps a lot of people from getting into the vintage calls. They just, they want, we just, the society anymore is just, they need instant gratification. And with vintage calls, you just can't always get instant gratification because they're not always available.
Yeah, and I think it would have an influence on the makers as well because they're not getting to have that experience. We always talk about that with new collectors. Like if you want to get into collecting, like one of the most important things is to go to shows and handle calls or handle decoys so you could get familiar with them, so to better know them and understand them.
Yeah, shows are definitely one of the better ways to do it and meet collectors. We're trying here to do a call makers and collectors social. We do once a month, and that's the intentions, behind it is to introduce people to collect and come. Or even if you want to make calls, there'll be some of us here that'll help you. Mm-hmm. You can, our little classroom up here, people display whether it's calls that they make to sell or, I'll bring some older calls that
let people
just
handle.
and do that, and try to get people interested in it. I think the most important things you can do, obviously, is read. Read as much as you can about stuff. Try to learn. Old auction catalogs are a great piece too, a tool to learn stuff by. And then try to get a mentor. Try to find an older collector. They don't have to be older, an experienced collector.
Yeah.
That
they're mostly older, but
right,
yeah.
right. That's or somebody recommends. That's. Not that everybody's not trustworthy, but somebody that's interested in it for the same reasons you are and can help you, and show you calls of their collection, and help you figure out what to buy and what to get into. Because it is intimidating. If you want to get into something, not a lot about it, and you see these prices, and then you hear about somebody buying a call that's maybe it's, pieced together, not original, or this or that. There's a lot of things that can be discouraging, mm-hmm. as a collector. So that's one of the best things I know to do, because there's still people. Not by any means do I know that much about them, but there's people that I learn from still today, and I've been around it for a long time. I mean, I've been around it longer than Ryan, and I learned stuff from Ryan. I don't like to admit that, but, so that's one of the cool things about gathering with other collectors is you always seem to learn something, and one of not to cut you off, but one thing is people ask about that, about buying older calls and spending that money in there. Mm-hmm. Try to always. Two things. Try to buy the best quality that you can afford, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And somebody, was a decoy collector, told me, said, if you're on a 1 to 10 scale, always try to purchase 8, 9s, and 10s, because when you have to get rid of them or trade them, or if you sell them, it's a lot easier to get rid of those 8, 9s, and 10s than it is 4, 5, and 6s. It's easy to say because I don't have this duck call and this one's not messed up, but maybe cracked or something, and it's a lot more affordable. You want to get it because you don't have this call maker or whatever. But if you wait around and save up your money, and maybe you're not going to be able to buy like 20 calls at one time, but maybe you buy one call a year, but make that one really, really good, or the best that you can afford. Okay. And I think that helps a lot. Yeah,
that's interesting because we've talked about, I guess, this is mostly with decoy collectors though. So I think it doesn't always go the same for different, but they always talk about like maybe buying something, you can buy more affordable things to then trade up. Is there a level to that? Like you can do that, but then like you're saying, like some won't be harder to get rid of to do that trade up. So
I think that, now this is totally my interpretation of that, but maybe what they're saying is if there's a decoy that's say is worth $500, but it's a 8, 9, or 10 of that maker, and 500 is its upper range, then that's what I would buy, and you would trade maybe 2 or 3 of those for a better one. That you still get the best quality of that maker that you can afford, and then you may, and they may not be that valuable. Like take, I'm trying to think of Madison Mitchell. His decoys are probably more affordable than a lot of other ones. Right. So maybe you get higher quality of those that would still cost you less money than Charles Purdue, early Charles Purdue, but then it might just take you 4 or 5 to either trade or sell later to get that one.
Okay,
something like that. That's the way I look. I don't know if that's the way they meant it.
I like that. Actually, it kind of it makes it a little more clear actually than like just saying it the other way. That makes more sense to me.
And that's how I built my entire collection. Yeah. When I started off, like, I had aspirations of, collecting, the higher end stuff, but I'm a school teacher, so, I don't have, tons of extra money to spend on calls. So, my collection's always had to pay for itself. So, that's exactly what I did. I would buy, I've probably got 400 calls, but, I've sold thousands of calls to be able to have the 400 that I've got, and I just always invested everything back into my collection.
Yeah, I think that's just kind of the evolution of collecting. Like, especially if you look at my collection now, instead of having, I bet at one time I probably had 800 duck calls. Now I probably have 300 or so, and the 300 are a lot better quality overall than that 800 was.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, like I said, I would buy collections of, 50, 60 calls, to get one call. But, I would do that, and, I would spend the next 2 years, piecing out the rest of it to pay for the, to pay for the one call that I got.
Yeah.
Which, and that adds an element to, collecting as well, because, by doing that, you're, I might have had like 3 or 4 cedar produce or something, and they might have been, a 2 or 3 out of a 10. I would sell those to get the 10, but it was a revolution. I was selling the 2s and 3s to somebody else that was more than likely going to be doing the same thing that I did.
Okay.
But, hopefully that was always getting more people involved in it. So
no, it makes it makes it clearer though. Like I like spelling, like using the examples like that. It makes it clear, because when people say that, I don't think it's necessarily clear to someone who doesn't really have experience in it, and that makes it a little clearer to me. Hey, well, Ryan, do you have a question for John? Since you've been on this call the whole time. Like, do you have a question that you would want to ask?
I know that right now, there's a lot of, guys trying to get, involved in vintage collecting. Like, do you have any advice for, these new collectors other than, we've always kind of went by the motto of quality over quantity, but is there any other advice you give to, to these newer collectors?
Man, we were kind of talking about that a little bit earlier, reading, obviously, the auction catalogs, but going to events and finding mentors is the best to me, and talk to other people that, when you're, let's say, selecting your mentors, it's not hard to. Once you go to a few shows, you see who you fit in with and who's, what stuff you like.
And collectors love when other people, that are showing interest in what they've got a passion for.
100%.
Yeah, so don't ever be too intimidated to walk up to people and ask them questions, because
when I was in high school, or later high school, in DuQuoin, Illinois, I was from Southern Illinois, there was a big decoy collector, Harvey Pitt, in DuQuoin, and he was an older guy. I was rather intimidated to to go over there, but somebody told me that he welcomed people, so after 16 I drove to his house, and just knocked on his front door, and he come to the door and sir, I'd like to look at your decoy collection, and he was just ecstatic that I wanted to do that. But like John said on the mentors, I've had so many myself, Bob Christensen being one of the ones, but I used to go visit, collectors, and I can't say that I've ever, been, when I started out collecting, that I ever called, a veteran collector, and they, at first, they kind of feel you out, and they want to know what you're after. But when they saw that when you're legitimately taking interest in it, they will open up the doors for you. I used to go to collectors' houses, all the time. But like I say, but the key thing is to show an interest. If you find an old duck call and all you're after is to find, want them to tell you exactly what it is and what to ask for it and all that, you're probably not going to get real far. But if you show a keen interest in it, absolutely everybody will want to help.
Right. Ask questions. Like, don't be afraid to ask stupid questions. Just ask questions, because it's important.
Yeah, just stay in time too. Like, asking questions is a good thing, because, anymore there's a lot of calls out there that are pieced together. There's a lot of calls out there that are completely counterfeit. And, the worst thing you can do is to be, head over heels into the hobby and save up a bunch of money and buy something, and then later find out that it's wrong. And, all that's going to want you to do is to get out of the hobby. And that's not what we want.
So I have a question, actually. So there's always been a really vibrant way of buying decoys, like either through auction and things like that. Whereas calls, it's a lot less so. So where, besides like the few auctions they have the little bit of calls in, where are new collectors going to buy these calls?
Well, I'll tell you, what I found out early on is like, I was, I would get the call collectors newsletter, and I would go in the back, or I forget which one. I guess it was that when you would get like a yearly deal that showed you who all the members were, and I would just go through it and I'd start calling people. But and that's how I found calls. And unfortunately with calls, like
that Ryan Graves boy.
Yeah.
yeah. Oh, I can guarantee it. They find out after a while, and that's how I was able to start buying calls. I always tell everybody, somebody might have had 1,000 decoys, but they only had one duck call. So there's never going to be many old duck calls for sale as there is decoys. And they can have 3 or 4 decoy auctions a year, and and not have any calls because they're just not available. So if you just sit and wait for auctions, and you're going to be disappointed. So it's a lot of legwork. I know John did the same thing with Biff Morgan and other collectors. Just contact older collectors. Everybody, whether you're a collector or not, everybody's still got something they'll sell. John now, like if somebody were to say, I really want an old duck call, like he'll go through his collection and he can find one that he'll part with. So it's just...
Well, that's nice. Not everyone's that way, though.
and shows, too. I mean, even like Reelfoot used to be a good one that we would get, you could buy calls from other collectors at.
Okay.
We hope Callapalooza will be. Jason Furlow used to have a show, and I don't know if he still has it in DeCoin or if it's moved.
Yeah, COVID kind of got in the way of that. Hopefully it'll...
So a lot of these shows have kind of changed because of that. But that, there was actually some duck call shows, not a lot, but 3 or 4 a year that were good ones to go to, too.
And right now, and to be honest, like the age when it comes to collecting vintage duck calls and stuff, it's very top heavy. Me and John are in our 40s. Like, we're probably 2 of the youngest vintage call collectors out there that are, seriously into the higher end stuff. And most of the ones that the larger collections are the guys in your, 60s, 70s, and 80s. So, there's not that there's not any in between there, but we need to start really working on, doing that backfill, getting more into the hobby,
right? Because,
before too long, there'll be things that come available.
And I think you and I talked about this before, Ryan. Like, it's usually not you had a different, you did it a way where you could collect them, but it's usually an older man's game just because of the financial reasons, because it's not always the easiest to get into.
Mm-hmm. Oh, it's not. And like I said, I think I told you then, like, unfortunately, there's no way, like, I'm not going to say there's no way. It'd be very hard for me to have what I've got now if I started today because, back then, like, I remember sitting in my dorm room at Western Illinois, like 98, 99, and, I would write on my hand. That was like when eBay came out, I like had to be back at my room at 6:45 because an auction went off at 7:30, because it would take me, even in my dorm room, it would take me 20 minutes for dial-up to get on the internet, then to sit there and just wait, and you can, there is none of that anymore. It's, everybody's got a smartphone, everybody's got the eBay apps, and, back then there used to be stuff that showed up all the time. Nobody knew what it was. And there wasn't an avenue for people to, like Facebook and message boards and all that for people to discuss it. So, I just got into it at the right time, so to speak. But like say, but the thing is too, like, if I always say, collecting's work. It's a lot of work, I've put a lot of work. John's put a lot of work in his collection. It's just that, if you want it, anything you want, you can make it happen, just hard work.
Yeah, well, I agree with that. I kind of want to go back because we mentioned your mentor before, but can you speak on Biff Morgan, right? Can you speak on him a little bit and how that influenced you? And stuff?
Yeah, actually, I met Biff through my wife, Angie. Her parents were friends with a banker here in Stuttgart, and Biff was a banker in Little Rock. And so Biff traveled the state. I don't remember what the name of the bank was he worked for, but he obviously traveled a lot, visited other banks. And so Angie's parents, I guess they were talking about collecting duck calls, and he was saying how big of a collection he had, so he wanted to meet me. And after that, we just hit it off good as far as I would have been, I'd have been probably college when I met him. Mm-hmm. So I'd have been in the 90s. He just helped me as far as, that's about the time the Arkansas Sportsman's Almanac came out, and his calls were in the back. Mm-hmm. I'd go over to his house in Little Rock, and then we got to, there was a restaurant in North Little Rock called Fisher's. That was, I'd go at least once a month and meet him over there, and he would bring either some calls that he had found, mm-hmm. Or was selling. And his big thing was, he would always ask me, who made this or that. Like, it would be like a little pop quiz you had. And then he would, he was big on trading for calls that he didn't have, Okay. So like, he would want me to look in this area to try to find calls, and then we'd meet up and either swap calls or, if didn't, he would buy one that I had or vice versa. And he was more he wanted to have one of every call from Arkansas. That was kind of his deal. So, man, he was a great help to me, on that. And because I can remember when I went to his house the first time, and he would also travel around to like different civic organizations in the state and promote calls. And he was one of the first guys that I really knew that did that. Like he might come to Stuttgart and give a speech to the Lions Club about collecting calls, and he'd have these little travel cases that he'd bring us calls. And that was the first time I'd ever seen a Ira Green Ferguson duck call. Like I didn't even know those existed. And like to me, that's like the pinnacle of Arkansas calls, So I really got to see a lot of cool calls from him, and he really helped me as far as trying to understand how to collect, like getting out and trying to find stuff, from other people. So it was a fun time because it wasn't like when I started, duck call collecting was kind of new, I mean, it wasn't that new, but it's not like it is now.
No,
And so when I had met Biff, it was starting to get even more ramped up, but there was still a lot of stuff out there that was available.
Right.
And it was neat. He was a good bridge to the gap from some of these older call makers, and me being a younger call maker as far as talking and visiting with them and learning stuff. So he was a really, really big help.
Yeah, that's awesome. Have you spec hunted at all?
I have. Yeah, I spec hunted. I've never really done the early season until this year, just because usually we just have so much going on that we don't. But I was going to make a point to do it, and so I got all my stuff ready in time, and I'm still working on some duck blinds that we need to get ready. And hopefully we'll have that this week.
When y'all open this weekend?
No, it's the 19th, I believe. So not this week, but the next weekend.
Okay.
So.
Yeah, because y'all usually open before Thanksgiving, then close and open after Thanksgiving.
Yeah, so I have been able to go spec hunt maybe 3 or 4 times, and it's been fun. I mean, I hate to admit it, the first day I didn't fire a shot. That makes you feel kind of bad when you're a call maker and supposed to know what you're doing. But we just really, being as dry, we did not have the specs around. They were concentrated in reservoirs that had water, but they would get up out of our reservoir and go everywhere but on our property, I think.
That happens.
The next day we adjusted and just set up between where they were getting up and where they were wanting to go, and we were able to talk a few of them into coming in. So it was fun.
Yeah, that's fun. Ryan, when do y'all open for Tennessee?
Oh, we open, Kentucky opens Thanksgiving Day, then Tennessee opens on that Saturday.
Yeah.
So before Thanksgiving. So.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you both for coming on the show.
Yeah, I enjoyed it. Thanks for asking.
Talk to you all next time.
Thanks again, Ryan and John, for coming on the show. Thanks to our producer, Chris Isaac, and thanks to you, our listeners, for supporting wetlands and waterfowl conservation.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the DU Podcast. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the show, and visit www.ducks.org/DU Podcast for resources based on today's topics, as well as access to more episodes. Opinions expressed by guests do not necessarily reflect those of Ducks Unlimited. Until next time, stay tuned to the Ducks. Stay tuned to the Ducks.